My phone lit up just as the judge finished welcoming the new attorneys, and with one glance, my chest split open. "We are at Mason S. ribbon cutting," my father wrote. "Do not make this about you." I stood in the marble hallway outside the federal courtroom, still holding the oath packet that had taken me nearly a decade of sleepless nights, scholarship applications, borrowed textbooks, and humiliations to earn. Around me, families surged forward with flowers, cameras, and trembling pride. Mothers kissed tearful daughters. Fathers slapped sons on the back with shining eyes. Laughter rose into the high white ceiling like bells. I had no one. A second message came through. It was a photo. My parents stood beside my brother in Savannah, smiling under a spray of gold confetti as he gripped oversized scissors in front of his newest luxury development. Mason looked exactly the way he always did when the world bent toward him. Polished. Certain. Worshipped. My mother's hand rested proudly on his arm. My father stood broad and glowing beside him, like he had built the city himself. Not one of them had come to my swearing-in. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. Then I lifted my head and forced my face into something calm as a cluster of my new colleagues walked past with their families. One of them, Claire, glanced at the empty space beside me and asked softly, "Where are your parents?" "Stuck in traffic," I lied. Even as I said it, the lie burned. My father had not been stuck anywhere. He had chosen. My mother had chosen. And Mason, as always, had been chosen over me without even needing to ask. That was the oldest story in our family. Mason was the bright flame. Mason was the future. Mason was the son with the easy grin, the booming confidence, the talent for walking into a room and making people forget to ask hard questions. I was the one who fixed what he broke. The one who stayed up reading contracts, catching mistakes, rewriting proposals, untangling the knots he left behind. My parents called me capable when they wanted free labor and difficult when I wanted dignity. At 14, I had won a statewide writing prize. My mother missed the ceremony because Mason had a sailing competition. At 21, I graduated at the top of my class. My father left early to take Mason to a networking dinner. At 27, when I passed the bar after months of living on coffee and panic, Mason sent a text with one word. Nice. My mother called 3 days later to ask if I could review paperwork for one of his investors. Even then, I said yes. That was the worst part. Not what they did. What I allowed. The courtroom doors opened behind me, and Judge Eleanor Whitmore stepped into the hall, her robe whispering across the stone. She had the kind of face that had seen every form of human weakness and still chosen not to despise the world. She looked at the packet in my hand, then at my expression. "You did not come this far to be invisible," she said. The words landed harder than comfort should have. For one terrifying second, I thought I might cry there in the hallway like a child forgotten after school. But I did not. I swallowed the ache whole. That night, alone in my apartment with my suit still on and the city lights smearing gold across the windows, I opened the family group chat. It was overflowing with photos from Mason's event. Proud of our boy. The Hart legacy continues. Savannah's next great builder. Hearts. Applause. Champagne glasses. No one had mentioned me. I closed the app and opened a folder I had not touched in years. Inside was my grandmother Rowan's old birth certificate, a scanned letter in her elegant hand, and the name she used to whisper to me when I was little and the house felt too cold. "If they refuse to see you, Eliza," she once told me, "build a life so bright they have to squint." Just then, an email appeared in my inbox from a Chicago firm specializing in financial compliance and complex investigations. They wanted me. Not because I was Mason Hart's sister. Not because I could clean up someone else's mess. Because my work had reached them, and they knew exactly what I was worth. I sat there in the hush of my ruined celebration and understood something with perfect clarity. My family had spent my whole life treating me like a shadow. They had forgotten that shadows only exist because something powerful is standing in the light. Chicago in winter did not welcome people. It tested them. The wind came first, slicing between towers of glass and steel, slipping beneath coats, needling through seams, making even the strongest pedestrians bow their heads and push forward like fighters entering a storm. When I stepped out of the taxi with 2 suitcases, a garment bag, and the last scraps of my old life folded into a leather satchel, I felt the city look straight through me. For the first time in my life, that felt like freedom. No one here knew I was Robert and Diane Hardess' overlooked daughter. No one knew I had spent years smiling through family dinners where my achievements were treated like polite background music while Mason's every impulsive move was praised as genius. In Chicago, I was not an afterthought. I was not the quiet fixer trailing behind a golden sun. I was simply Eliza Rowan, a woman with a sharp mind, a new position, and the dangerous, trembling hope that maybe reinvention was real. My new office occupied the upper floors of a dark stone building near the river, its lobby all polished brass and silent ambition. The firm specialized in financial compliance, internal investigations, and regulatory crisis management. We were the people companies called when they were terrified. When the numbers no longer made sense. When signatures looked clean but smelled rotten. When money moved too fast, too quietly, through too many hands. I had spent years learning how to read people who lied with smiles. Now I was learning how to read balance sheets that lied with elegance. My supervisor, Vanessa Cole, had a gaze that peeled excuses off people before they finished speaking. She wore restraint like armor and never wasted words. On my 3rd day, she dropped a thick file onto my desk and told me to flag anything inconsistent. By lunch, I had marked 12 irregularities. By evening, I had found 19 more. She stood over my shoulder in the dimming office, scanning my notes in silence. I waited for skepticism. For condescension. For the familiar shift in tone that meant a man would soon repeat my own ideas back to me as if he had discovered them himself. Instead, Vanessa nodded once. "You do not just read documents," she said. "You hear them panic." It was the strangest compliment I had ever received. It also felt like the first honest one. The work suited me with frightening precision. I could see patterns where others saw clutter. Shell companies nested inside holding groups. Rounded invoices repeated across unrelated vendors. Missing disclosures. Timing mismatches. Risk assessments softened just enough to look accidental. On paper, fraud often dressed like sophistication. My job was to strip it naked. And I was good at it. That was the secret my family had never understood. Mason had charisma. I had control. He could command a room for 10 minutes. I could dismantle an empire line by line. A week into the job, I met Daniel Cross in the Forensic Review Unit. He was thoughtful, unhurried, with the kind of face that did not demand attention but earned trust anyway. He asked smart questions, listened to the full answer, and never once treated my competence like a surprise. When he brought coffee to my desk after a late meeting, he set it down gently and said, "I figured you were too focused to remember food or sleep." I looked up, startled into a laugh. That, more than the coffee, warmed me. Days became weeks. The city remained cold, but my life did not. I learned the rhythm of the trains, the glow of the river at dusk, the comfort of walking home without bracing for someone else's disappointment. I changed my email signature. I signed reports with my new name. Each time I did, something inside me settled deeper into place. Then Savannah found me again. My mother sent an email with no greeting and no apology. Mason's company is expanding aggressively. They may need outside legal guidance soon. If you are willing to be useful, there could be a place for you. Be useful. Not "we miss you," not "we were wrong," not "we should have been there." I stared at the message until anger rose in me like heat under ice. Even from another state, even after everything, they still reached for me the same way. Not as a daughter. Not as a person. As a tool. I deleted the email. The next morning, our case management system flagged a real estate portfolio for enhanced review. I opened the file absently, still thinking about my mother's message. Then I saw the first company name and went completely still. Heart Urban Legacy Holdings. My pulse stumbled. I kept reading. A web of property acquisitions. Layered financing. Quiet transfers through limited liability entities with bland names and aggressive timing. On its face, it looked polished. Impressive, even. But beneath the shine, something was off. The funding sources were obscured. The disclosures were incomplete. The paper trail moved with the slippery precision of someone who believed appearance could outrun truth. I stared at the screen, the office noise fading into a dull roar around me. I had changed my name. I had changed my city. I had changed my life. But somehow, impossibly, my family had landed on my desk anyway. I did not report the conflict immediately. For almost an hour, I simply sat there, staring at the screen while the name glowed back at me like a hand reaching from a grave I had already buried. Heart Urban Legacy Holdings. The words looked polished, expensive, respectable. Mason had always understood the theater of success. He knew which suit to wear, which investor to charm, which camera angle made him look visionary instead of vain. He knew how to sell a dream so brightly that no one noticed the rot in its foundation. But I knew him better than anyone. I knew how quickly he cut corners when no one was watching. I knew how often my father called recklessness boldness when it came from his son. I knew how my mother could smooth over anything if it meant preserving the illusion that the Hart family was untouchable. And for the first time, that illusion had landed inside my jurisdiction. I pushed back from my desk and walked to the far window of the conference room, my pulse beating against my throat. Below me, Chicago moved in silver ribbons of traffic and frozen light. Everyone kept going. Everyone had somewhere to be. The world did not pause because one woman had just discovered that the family who broke her heart might also be breaking the law. I wanted to believe I was wrong. I wanted the irregularities to be innocent, the incomplete disclosures to be clerical laziness, the layered entities to be aggressive but legal strategy. I wanted, against all reason, for my father not to be exactly who I feared he was. I wanted Mason to be merely arrogant, not criminal. I wanted the story of my family to remain tragic and small, not dangerous. But the documents kept breathing their own truth. By noon I requested a private meeting with Vanessa Cole. She entered my office with a legal pad in one hand and that calm, unreadable expression that made people confess before she asked a question. I closed the door behind her and forced myself to speak clearly. There is a conflict, I said. Heart Urban Legacy is owned by my family. She did not flinch. She only nodded once, as if this were another fact among facts. Tell me everything relevant, she said. So I did. I told her Mason was the public face of the company, my father drove the strategy, my mother managed relationships and donor circles, and I had cut personal contact after years of being used as unpaid legal support and emotional furniture. I told her I had no financial interest, no communication with the firm, and no desire to be involved beyond professional disclosure. I expected suspicion. I expected removal. I expected the old humiliation of being tied to their choices whether I liked it or not. Instead Vanessa listened, then folded her hands. You did the right thing by coming in immediately, she said. You will be screened from final recommendations, but I want you on contextual analysis. You know how these people think. Use that wisely. For a second, I could not answer. All my life, truth had been something that cost me. In that moment, it became the first thing that gave me power. The deeper we dug, the uglier it became. The portfolio included luxury redevelopment projects in Savannah, Charleston, and Jacksonville, all tied together by shell companies that seemed designed less for efficiency than concealment. Funds flowed in and out through bland holding entities with patriotic names and forgettable office addresses. There were discrepancies in tenant relocation disclosures. Risk memos had been softened. Supporting documents appeared to have been backdated. One acquisition had closed only days after a suspicious cash injection from an offshore-linked fund with no clear beneficial owner. Daniel sat across from me one evening in a glass-walled review room, both of us surrounded by printouts, highlighters, and empty coffee cups. Snow tapped softly against the window behind him. "This is not sloppy," he said quietly. "This is designed." I looked at the pages spread between us. Designed. Yes. That was the word. Not chaos. Architecture. Someone had built this structure carefully, with just enough polish to pass surface review and just enough fragmentation to keep responsibility moving. That someone sounded like my father, that confidence felt like Mason, that smoothness smelled like my mother. Later that night, I received a message from an unknown number. "You found it, did not you? If you want the full picture, meet me tomorrow." "Come alone, Nora Bell." I stared at the screen until my reflection stared back. Nora had been one of the few people at Heart Development who ever looked me in the eye like I was human. She ran internal accounting for years, quiet and meticulous, the kind of woman who kept every receipt because she trusted memory less than paper. When she vanished from the company, my mother called her unstable. Mason called her disloyal. My father said nothing at all, which told me more than either of them. We met at a narrow diner off Milwaukee Avenue where the coffee tasted burnt and the booths leaned tiredly toward the floor. Nora looked older than I remembered, not in years but in wear. Her hands trembled only once, when she passed me a thick envelope beneath the table. "I should have gone to someone sooner," she said. I kept telling myself it was temporary. Then it got bigger. Then it got dangerous. Inside the envelope were printouts of internal emails, wire summaries, draft disclosures, and a handwritten note in the margin of one report that made my stomach turn. "Delay tenant notices until closing. Legal can clean language after execution." Legal can clean language. For one sickening moment, I saw myself in every year before I left, red penning vague clauses, rewriting predatory wording, polishing things I had not created but still helped survive. I had told myself I was only fixing grammar. Only organizing. Only helping. The shame hit hard and fast, hot enough to make my eyes sting. Nora watched my face crumble. "You did not know," she said. "That is why they kept you at the edges. They knew if you saw the whole thing, you would never stay." I wanted to believe that comfort. I wanted to accept it and place my guilt somewhere outside myself. But guilt is rarely that obedient. It settled into me anyway, heavy as wet wool. The final blow came 2 days later when a tenant advocacy file surfaced in related litigation records. A widow named Evelyn Price, 73 years old, had filed a complaint claiming she and other long-term residents were pressured out of their rent-protected building under misleading redevelopment notices tied to a Heart entity. The language in the notices was elegant, technical, nearly bloodless. That was the cruelty of people like my father. They did not need to scream. They could evict you with a smile and a packet of professionally bound lies. I went home that night and stood in my kitchen with my coat still on, staring at my phone. The city outside was dark blue and glittering. My apartment was quiet enough to hear the hum of the refrigerator. For a long time I did nothing. Then I called home. My mother answered first, her voice bright with immediate performance. "Eliza. This is a surprise." "Do not," I said, and the sharpness in my own voice seemed to shock us both. "Do not do the sweet mother routine with me. I need to speak to Dad and Mason now." There was a pause, then the muffled handover, then my father's voice, curt and impatient. "This better be important." I closed my eyes. For one last moment, I tried to hand him a bridge. "You need to stop what you are doing," I said. "Freeze pending transactions. Preserve records. Get independent counsel. If you cooperate early, the damage may be containable." Silence. Then a short, humorless laugh from Mason as he came onto the line. "Listen to her," he said. Still desperate to feel important. My grip tightened around the phone. "I am trying to save innocent people from what happens next," I said. There are bad funds in your projects. Fraud exposure. Tenant complaints. Backdated documents. This is bigger than a compliance issue. My father cut in, voice rising with the old contempt that had kept me small for years. You always did mistake paperwork for real power. Something in me went still. No, I said. You did. Mason started talking over me, calling me bitter, jealous, dramatic, accusing me of using my job to settle family grievances because I could not stand watching him win. My mother tried to soften the edges, but only enough to protect him, never enough to hear me. The same pattern. The same worship. The same erasure. Only this time I was no longer trapped inside it. You think I called because I want your approval, I said, my voice low and deadly calm. I called because I wanted to see if there was any part of this family left worth warning. But you are not being framed. You are not misunderstood. You built a machine that eats people and hides behind polished speeches. No one answered. I could hear breathing. My father, rough and furious. My mother, small and frightened. Mason, quick with disbelief, because for the first time in his life, I was not speaking to him like a sister asking to be seen. I was speaking to him like a witness. Then I ended the call. I stood alone in the dark, phone still warm in my hand, and understood what had just happened. For years, my family had mistaken my silence for weakness. They had mistaken my patience for dependence. They had mistaken my love for permission. They were wrong. That night I sent everything through formal channels, documented every contact, and authorized counsel to begin witness protection steps for Nora if needed. I did it cleanly. Lawfully. Irreversibly. And as I pressed send, I felt something old and bruised inside me finally stop begging to be chosen. My family was not afraid of doing wrong. They were afraid of being seen. Savannah glittered the way a polished knife glittered. Beautiful from a distance. Dangerous when it caught the light just right. By the time my plane landed, Mason had already turned the city into a stage set for his resurrection. His face smiled down from banners outside the new Harbor Crescent Hotel, all white stone, black iron balconies, and curated Southern elegance. News stations called it a symbol of urban renewal. Lifestyle magazines called it a love letter to the city's historic district. Investors called it visionary. My mother called it proof that the heart name was stronger than rumors. Rumors. That was what my family had reduced it to. Not fraudulent disclosures. Not obscured funding. Not residents pushed out of homes they had occupied for decades. Not shell entities wrapped around dirty money like silk around a blade. Just rumors. Ugly, inconvenient whispers that would surely disappear if they smiled hard enough under enough chandeliers. The invitation had arrived 2 days earlier, embossed in gold, cold as arrogance. The Hart family requests the honor of your presence at the Harbor Crescent Legacy Gala. At the bottom, in my mother's tight, elegant handwriting, she had added one line. Family stands together. I almost laughed when I read it. Almost. The gala was not simply a celebration. It was a public cleansing. A performance engineered to reassure investors, seduce local officials, and drown scrutiny beneath crystal glasses and string quartets. Mason wanted the cameras. My father wanted the contracts signed under flattering light. My mother wanted me there for one reason only. I was the daughter who had become a federal-facing compliance attorney, the sister with a sharp title and a respectable face. If I stood beside them, even silently, I could be used like a human seal of approval. A daughter. A lawyer. A lie in a silk dress. The morning after I arrived, my mother asked to meet for coffee at the old hotel lounge near Forsyth Park. She was already seated when I walked in, elegant as ever in pearl earrings and cream wool, her posture composed, her expression carefully softened. She rose when she saw me, as though we were estranged women in a tasteful drama instead of a mother and daughter standing inside years of injury. Eliza, she said, voice trembling just enough to suggest feeling. You look tired. You look practiced, I replied. The hurt that crossed her face lasted less than a second. Then the mask returned. She folded her hands over her cup. Your father is under terrible stress. Mason too. This city is full of jealous people, and once gossip starts, it multiplies. They need stability tonight. They need family. I held her gaze. And what exactly do you need from me? Her eyes hardened by a fraction. Nothing dramatic. Just your presence. Stand with us. Smile for photographs. Let people see that whatever nonsense is being said, the family remains united. United. The word moved through me like broken glass. You still do not understand, do you? I said quietly. I am not refusing because I am angry. I am refusing because what they built is rotten. Her fingers tightened around the porcelain cup. You have always been so determined to see the worst in your brother. No, I said. I was the only one willing to see him clearly. For the first time, real irritation flashed across her face. Mason is building something meaningful. Jobs. Housing. Influence. Legacy. He carries pressure you could never understand. I leaned forward, and my voice dropped. Low enough that she had to listen. He carries pressure because you and Dad stuffed him full of worship and called it strength. You handed him applause every time he should have learned restraint. You buried every consequence before it could teach him anything. And now you want me to help bury this too. She went very still. There it was. Not grief. Not confusion. Not remorse. Calculation. She had not asked me here to mend anything. She had brought me home to be useful one more time. When I stood to leave, she said my name with a crack in her voice that might have moved me once. If this family breaks, she whispered, it will be because you chose not to save it. I looked down at the woman who had watched me disappear for years and only noticed when my absence became inconvenient. No, I said. If it breaks, it will be because all of you mistook silence for love. That evening Savannah arrived dressed for worship. Black cars lined the curb outside Harbor Crescent. Women stepped onto the red carpet wrapped in satin and diamonds. Men in tuxedos shook hands beneath towering arrangements of white lilies. Inside, the ballroom glowed gold beneath chandeliers the size of small planets. Every table shimmered with crystal, polished silver, and carefully printed name cards. Jazz drifted through the air like expensive perfume. And above it all hung the scent of panic. I could feel it beneath the lacquered calm. Investors were smiling a little too widely. City council members kept glancing at their phones. Reporters laughed with brittle enthusiasm. The room knew something was wrong. It just had not yet decided how wrong. I wore black. Not mourning. Armor. My father saw me first. For one brief instant, surprise loosened his face, followed by relief so naked it almost embarrassed him. He crossed the ballroom with his hand already extended, all command and ownership. You came, he said. I came to see what truth looks like when it finally reaches a room like this. His jaw tightened. We are not doing this tonight. We never did it any night, I said. Before he could answer, Mason swept toward us, radiant and lethal in a midnight tuxedo, every inch the man the city believed in. Cameras tracked him automatically. Attention clung to him as naturally as scent to roses. He smiled. When he reached me, that warm public smile he had used all his life to make cruelty look charming. There she is, he announced, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. My brilliant sister finally decided to show some family loyalty. A few heads turned. I felt the room begin to watch. I said nothing. Mason slipped an arm around my waist for the cameras, his grip too tight to be affectionate. To anyone else, it would have looked protective. Proud. Intimate. To me, it felt like a threat in a tailored sleeve. Whatever game you think you are playing, he murmured through his smile, end it. Tonight is too important. I turned my head slightly, just enough that my words hit only him. That is true, I said. It is the most important night of your life. He mistook my meaning for surrender and laughed softly. Across the ballroom, my mother visibly relaxed. My father exhaled. They thought they had done it. They thought they had dragged me back into formation, polished me, positioned me, and turned me once more into the quiet supporting piece that made Mason look stronger. The speeches began. A developer from Atlanta praised Mason's vision. A councilman praised revitalization. My mother dabbed the corners of her eyes as if overcome by maternal pride. My father stood like a king surveying conquered territory. Then Mason took the stage. He was magnificent at this part. That was the tragedy of men like him. They often were. He spoke about history and progress, about preserving beauty while building opportunity, about community, stewardship, and legacy. He thanked investors by name. He charmed officials with easy gratitude. He called the Harbor Crescent project a promise to the city. Then, with theatrical warmth, he invited me to stand so everyone could acknowledge his remarkable sister, whose work in the legal and compliance world, he said, proved that integrity ran in the family. Applause broke out around the ballroom. Hundreds of eyes turned toward me. For one suspended second, I remained seated. I could hear my own heartbeat. I could hear forks settle against plates. I could hear the electric hunger of a room that sensed something unscripted pressing against the edges of the night. Then I stood. Mason smiled wider. My mother joined the applause. My father lifted his glass. The cameras found my face and held it there. And then the ballroom doors opened. Not dramatically. Not with cinematic thunder. Just a clean, decisive swing of polished wood. 3 federal agents entered first, followed by financial investigators and uniformed officers from the local economic crimes unit. The music faltered mid-note. Glasses stopped halfway to mouths. A woman near the front laughed once, reflexively, because shock often borrows the sound of amusement before it learns its true name. The lead investigator stepped forward, voice calm and carrying. We are executing federal warrants related to financial fraud, false disclosures, obstruction, and unlawful property acquisition practices connected to entities operating under Hart Urban Legacy Holdings and related affiliates. Silence hit the room like a dropped anvil. Then sound returned all at once. Sharp. Chaotic. Someone gasped. Someone cursed. A chair scraped violently against the floor. Reporters lunged for phones. Investors surged backward as if physical distance could erase association. My mother went white beneath her makeup. My father did not move at all, the stillness of a man who had just realized control was a costume. And Mason turned to me. Not to the agents, not to our father, not to the room unraveling around him. To me. At last, he understood. His face did not collapse all at once. First came confusion. Then disbelief. Then something darker, more primitive, more naked than I had ever seen in him before. Fear. Not of prison, not yet. Not of headlines or lost contracts. Fear of me. Fear that the sister he had dismissed, belittled, and used as invisible scaffolding all his life had become the one person in the room he could not charm, command, or crush. You, he said, barely breathing the word. I met his stare without blinking. All your life, I thought, you were taught that power looked like being adored in public. Behind him, agents moved toward the stage. Papers were seized. Devices were requested. Names were called. The orchestra had gone silent. The chandeliers still burned overhead, bright and indifferent, pouring gold over every shocked face in the room. But real power did not smile for cameras, real power did not beg to be seen, real power waited, then it told the truth. And as my brother stood under the crushing glare of his own manufactured spotlight, I saw it happen. For the first time in his life, Mason Hart looked at me and understood that I had never been standing behind him. I had been standing above the fault line the whole time. And now it had opened. By sunrise, Savannah had turned on the Harts with the same hunger it had once used to praise them. The headlines came first. Developer family under federal investigation. Luxury legacy project tied to fraud claims. Elderly residents allege coercion in redevelopment scheme. By noon, every smiling photograph of Mason at the Harbor Crescent Gala had been transformed into evidence of arrogance. The city that had once toasted him now dissected him. Investors issued statements. Business partners vanished. People who had called my parents dear friends suddenly discovered scheduling conflicts and weak memories. That was the thing about borrowed power. It looked solid until fear touched it. My phone would not stop vibrating. Reporters. Unknown numbers. Former classmates who had ignored me for years. Distant relatives who suddenly wanted nuance. Beneath all of it, again and again, my mother. Then my father. Then Mason. Their names lit my screen like ghosts from a fire I had survived. I did not answer. Instead, I sat in the hotel room with the curtains half open, watching pale morning light spread across the river, and felt a strange stillness settle inside me. Not triumph. Not joy. The collapse of people you once loved does not taste sweet, no matter what they did to you. It tastes metallic. Sad. Final. Like biting through the inside of your cheek and realizing the blood is your own. But beneath the grief, there was something else. Relief. Not because they were suffering. Because the truth no longer belonged only to me. In the days that followed, the full shape of the damage emerged. Accounts were frozen. Project approvals were suspended. Internal communications surfaced. The shell entities my father had hidden behind began to connect like lights blinking on across a dark map. Nora Bell entered protected cooperation and turned over years of documentation, careful records she had kept while trying not to drown in what she knew. Evelyn Price and other displaced tenants found counsel willing to fight for them publicly. What my family had treated as clever business was finally being named for what it was. Predation dressed as progress. Theft draped in polished language. And Mason, stripped of the stage, seemed to shrink by the hour. When he finally cornered me outside the courthouse annex 3 days later, he looked nothing like the man from the gala. His jaw was rough with mist shaving. His tie hung crooked. The easy glow was gone, replaced by something frantic and unfinished. "You could have come to us," he said. I stared at him. "I did." He flinched. It was small, but I saw it. He remembered the call. He remembered laughing. His eyes hardened. "You wanted this. You always hated watching me win." "No," I said quietly. "I hated watching you destroy people and call it talent." For a moment, he looked as though he might say something cruel enough to reopen every wound I had ever carried. Instead, what rose in his face was weaker than cruelty. It was confusion. The confusion of a man who had been worshipped for so long that consequence felt like betrayal. "You are my sister," he said at last. I let the silence sit between us. That was the line they always reached for when every other weapon failed. Family. Blood. Loyalty. As if those words were sacred enough to erase years of contempt. As if love meant standing still while someone used your spine as scaffolding for their ambition. I said. And I warned you anyway." Then I walked past him. A week later, I received a letter from my mother, delivered by courier as though expense could restore dignity. The handwriting was steady, elegant, familiar. She wrote that the family had made mistakes. That my father was under extraordinary pressure. That Mason had been carrying too much responsibility too young. That perhaps they had not always shown appreciation in the right ways. Near the end, finally, came the closest thing to an apology. "We should have been there for your swearing in." I read that line 3 times. Not because it healed me. Because it arrived too late to do anything but prove I had been right all along. They had known. Somewhere beneath the excuses and the favoritism and the years of turning away, they had known exactly what they were doing. I did not write back immediately. When I finally did, my reply was 1 paragraph. I do not rejoice in your downfall. But I will never again confuse silence with love or obedience with peace. What happened was not caused by truth. It was caused by the lies you expected everyone else to carry for you. That was all. Then I went back to Chicago and stepped into the life I had built with my own hands. The offer came 2 months later. A National Housing Integrity Initiative wanted me to lead a new compliance and resident protection division, one focused on exposing financial abuse in redevelopment deals and protecting vulnerable tenants from being pushed out through legal manipulation. They did not want Mason Hart's sister. They wanted the woman who had disclosed a conflict cleanly, followed the evidence without flinching, and refused to sell justice for comfort. I accepted before the day ended. Not long after, with grant backing and restitution funds released through related settlements, I helped launch the Rowan House Initiative, named for the grandmother who had once seen me clearly before I knew how to see myself. We offered legal aid, relocation advocacy, and whistleblower support for people trapped beneath polished systems designed to crush them quietly. The first time I saw the name on the glass doors, sunlight burning across the letters, I stood still for a long moment. All my life, I had been treated like a shadow in someone else's story. Now I was standing in a building that existed because I had finally stepped out of it. Sometimes people ask whether it was worth it. Whether telling the truth was worth losing a family. I think the better question is this. Was it ever truly a family if love only survived when I stayed small enough to be useful? If you were in my place, would you have stayed silent to keep the peace, or spoken up and let the truth break what was already broken? Comment below and tell me. And if stories like this one move you, stories about betrayal, reckoning, and finding your real worth, like this video and subscribe to Still Waters Payback.